The morning she arrived at Wrentham House, the rain had stopped just long enough to make the stone steps gleam. Cecily Ashton stood at the base of them and looked up at the facade, at the long Georgian windows and the stone urns at the entryway, at the footman already watching her from the doorway, as though uncertain whether she warranted the effort of an umbrella. She was not a grand sight. She wore a sage green gown that had been let out at the sleeves twice, a dark wool Spencer jacket that had belonged to her mother, and kid gloves gone thin at the thumb. The small cedar box in her hands was the most respectable object she carried, and she held it as a solicitor holds a brief, level and deliberate, so that it could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. What it contained was a gold seal, roughly the size of a shilling, bearing the crest of the Duchy of Wrentham, which had been sitting in her mother's cedar box among the lace handkerchiefs and the folded letters for the better part of 3 years. The footman descended. He took her name with the flat civility of a man accustomed to assessing visitors in under 4 seconds. She gave it plainly. "Miss Cecily Ashton, of Hartfield Cottage. I have an appointment with His Grace." She had no such appointment. She had sent a letter. Whether the letter had been received was a matter she had chosen to resolve in person. The entrance hall of Wrentham House was the kind of space designed to remind a visitor of their proper scale. The ceiling was 20 feet if it was an inch, the marble floor was the color of old bone, and the staircase curved upward with the measured grandeur of something that had been designed to be descended. Cecily stood inside it and kept her spine level and her chin up, which her mother had told her was the only available response to rooms like this. She did not see the Duke at first. She was watching the solicitor who had materialized from a side corridor, a florid-faced man of perhaps 50, with thinning gray-blonde hair and the particular walk of someone accustomed to controlling access. "Miss Ashton," he said, and the way he said it placed her in a category. "I believe there has been some confusion. His Grace is not available to receive visitors without prior arrangement." "I wrote 3 weeks ago," she said. "I have the letter. Letters are received in considerable volume. If you will leave your card and the nature of your inquiry, we can arrange to have the matter addressed at the proper channel." "The matter cannot be addressed by correspondence," she said, before he had finished. She kept her voice level, unhurried, the way her mother had taught her to speak in rooms that were designed to diminish. "I have property belonging to His Grace, and I have a document he has a legal obligation to read. I would prefer to deliver both in person." It was at this moment that she became aware of a stillness on the staircase. She looked up. He was not descending. He had simply stopped on the 3rd step from the landing and stood there with one hand resting on the banister and his eyes on her face, and the quality of his attention was not what she had expected from a duke. She had expected the sideways glance of a man performing notice. This was something else, steady and particular, the way a man looks when he has heard something through a closed door, and is now determining whether it is worth opening. She held the cedar box a fraction tighter. "Mr. Fenwick," the Duke said, his voice carrying without effort down the high ceiling of the hall. "Show Miss Ashton to the morning room." The solicitor stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Your Grace, Lady Harcastle has already expressed her reservations about this visit." "The morning room, Fenwick," the Duke said, and the repetition of it was all the instruction Fenwick required. He came down the remaining stairs at a measured pace, and she held her ground on the marble floor and waited for him. If the world that produced Margaret Ashton had been just, her daughter would have grown up in a house with a linen press and a proper kitchen garden, and shoes that did not wear at the heel. Margaret Ashton had been the daughter of a Hertfordshire rector, educated above her station and married at 22, to a man with prospects that had dissolved with his health. Richard Ashton had been a land agent, capable and precise, employed for 9 years by the previous Duke of Wrentham, the current Duke's father, to manage the northern parcels of the estate. He had been good at it. He had also, in the winter of 1812, lent a significant portion of his savings to the estate in a moment of cash difficulty, against a written agreement, signed and sealed, that the sum would be returned with 4% interest upon the sale of the northern parcels. Richard Ashton had died the following spring of a lung fever, never having recovered the money. Margaret had pursued the claim for 7 years. She had written letters, engaged a solicitor of her own, a kind but ineffective man in the village who had since died himself, and twice traveled to Wrentham House in person, where she had been received politely and told that the matter was being reviewed. The money, £460 at 4% compounding over 9 years, now exceeded £700. £700 was the difference between Cecily's life and a tolerable one. It was the difference between Hartfield Cottage and a hired room, between a whole shoe and a darned one. Margaret had died in the autumn of 1821. She had left Cecily 3 things of note: the cedar box, the letter of demand in her own clear handwriting, and the instruction to be neither ashamed of what was owed to them nor ungentle in asking for it. The winter after Margaret died was the longest Cecily had known. She had moved to a single hired room above the apothecary's shop in the village, taking only what she could carry, and she had lived there for 8 months on the remnant of her mother's savings and the small income from teaching the apothecary's daughters their letters and arithmetic. She had kept her mother's green Spencer jacket because it was warm. She had kept the cedar box because she could not bring herself not to, even though for the first months she could not open it. She had opened it in March, when the savings were running to their end, and she had understood that she would need to make a decision about where she would go next. And going through her mother's effects was one of the things she had been putting off doing. She had expected the handkerchiefs. She had expected the letters from her father which she had read before. And the small pearl earrings her mother had never sold because they had been a gift from the rector on her mother's own wedding day. The seal had been in the cedar box when Cecily opened it, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, cold against her fingers, heavier than she had expected, for something so small. She had not known what it was at first. She had recognized the crest only when she had taken it to the village rector, who had gone quite pale and told her that it was the Duke of Wrentham's seal, the great one, and that it had been reported missing some years prior. She had written to Wrentham House the following morning, and she had made a second copy of her mother's demand in her own hand, which she kept separate from the original in case one was lost. And she had sat at the small table above the apothecary's shop with the 2 documents before her and thought about her mother making the same calculation, and she had felt something harden quietly at the center of her chest. Not bitterness exactly, but the particular resolution that arrives when one has simply decided. The morning room was quiet and smelled of cedar and beeswax. Cecily set the cedar box on the writing table and sat in the chair across from the empty one and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The rain had resumed outside the tall windows. She watched it run down the glass in small, crooked rivulets. The Duke arrived 7 minutes later without the solicitor, which she had not expected, and without the aunt. She had been half expecting even less. He came in alone and closed the door, and she rose from the chair. He was taller than he had appeared on the stairs, slate blue eyes under heavy brows, a long straight nose, a small scar at the left jaw that a lesser man would have tried to hide. He was perhaps 35 or 36, and he carried himself with the constrained precision of someone who had learned to contain the dimensions of his own authority to avoid frightening the furniture. "Miss Ashton," he said. "Please sit." She sat. He took the chair across from her, and she noticed that he did not look at the cedar box. He looked at her face. "You said you have property belonging to the estate. I said I have property belonging to your grace." She opened the cedar box and set the seal on the writing table between them. The great seal of the Duchy of Wrentham. "I found it among my late mother's effects." He looked at the seal for a long moment. Nothing moved in his face. Then he reached forward and lifted it carefully with 2 fingers, turned it over, examined the crest with the considered quiet of someone who has found something he had ceased expecting to find. "And the document?" he said. She produced the letter from the inner pocket of her Spencer jacket. It was folded into quarters and worn at the creases, the paper the color of weak tea from having been carried and unfolded and refolded many times. She had touched it so often she could feel the particular texture of her mother's script through the paper without seeing it. She set it on the table without unfolding it. "My mother's demand," she said. Written in her own hand. for the return of a loan made by my father to the previous Duke in 1812, with interest compounded at the agreed rate. The total now owed is £714. She paused. The seal was in her box. I cannot tell you how it came to be there. I can only tell you that I found it, and that I am returning it, because it is not mine. The demand, however, is entirely mine, and I would like your grace to read it. He unfolded the letter. She watched him read it. His face did not change in the way people's faces change when they are reading something inconvenient, the slight tightening, the controlled exhalation. He read it with attention, and when he had finished, he held it for a moment longer before setting it back on the table. The door opened behind him. Mr. Fenwick entered, without knocking. Your Grace, Lady Hardcastle asks that I convey her, Fenwick began, and Lady Hardcastle herself appeared in the doorway before he could finish. She is nothing more than a woman with a grievance and a dead mother's story. The voice came from the corridor, cool and carrying, and then Lady Hardcastle herself appeared behind the solicitor, silver-haired, imperious, a woman who had spent 60 years making doorways feel smaller than they were. Her eyes moved over Cecily with the particular assessment of someone who had already completed her calculation. I do hope we are not entertaining demands from every former employee's family who considers themselves owed a debt. My father was not a former employee, Lady Hardcastle, Cecily said. He was a creditor. The distinction landed in the silence between them. Fenwick, the Duke said, without turning to look at either of them. I will speak with you this afternoon, Lady Hardcastle. A single word of address that meant what it meant. The aunt withdrew. The solicitor followed her, and the quality of his departure was something Cecily filed away. The Duke looked back at the letter. I will need time to examine the estate records, he said. The loan your father made, and its terms will be documented if the agreement was properly executed. I assume it was. Given this. He nodded at the demand. I would ask that you remain in the county while the matter is investigated. If you are willing, there is a guest room at the disposition of the household. She had not anticipated this. I would not wish to impose, she said. You are not imposing, he said. And the words were level, without inflection, the way he said everything, so that what they conveyed was not warmth exactly, but a kind of precision that was, she thought, its own form of care. She said she would stay. The room they gave her was on the second floor, small and clean, with a window that looked over the kitchen garden, rather than the park. She thought her mother would have liked that. Her mother had been a woman who preferred things that grew over things that merely displayed. On the third evening, Cecily went to the library. She had not intended to stay long. She had wanted only to return a book she had borrowed from Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper, a thin volume of collected essays that had been sitting on the hall table. The library was warm, and the rain was against the windows again, and she found herself settling into the chair by the fire with the demand letter in her hands. She did not mean to read it aloud. She had read it so many times that the words had become a kind of private liturgy, and sometimes when she was very tired and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be felt longest, she found comfort in hearing her mother's careful legal phrasing in her own voice. So she read quietly, the fire crackling beside her. The loan was contracted in the winter of 1812 at the rate of 4% per annum against the written assurance of the Duchy of Wrentham and sealed by its authority. It was not a favor. It was not a gift. It was money given in good faith and recorded in good faith. And it is owed. She heard him a moment before she saw him. He was standing in the doorway. He had not knocked because there was nothing to knock on. The door being already open, and he had clearly arrived recently enough that he had not announced himself, which meant he had been there for some portion of the reading. The candle in his hand threw its light up along the left side of his face, and the scar at his jaw was visible, and he looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given her in the entrance hall, the particular steady regard of a man who had heard something through a closed door and had chosen to open it. She closed the letter. I beg your pardon, she said. I had not thought anyone would be listening. Do not stop. He said it quietly. Then, after a breath more carefully, "On my account." He came inside. He set the candle on the nearest table and stood for a moment by the window, and she could see that he was not simply filling time. There was something in his face that was present and considering, some private reckoning she was not privy to. "Your mother wrote that herself," he said. "Yes. The phrasing is exact. She understood the law. She had 9 years to study it," Cecily said, and heard the edge in her own voice, and softened it. She was precise about everything. It was one of the things she was. He turned from the window. He looked at the letter in her hands for a moment, and then at her face, and something shifted in the quality of the room, the way the light lies differently after a cloud has passed. "I am going to find what happened to this claim," he said. "Not because the law requires it, because it is the right thing." He paused. "That distinction is worth naming." She looked at him directly. She was aware of the fire behind her, and the warmth of the room, and the particular smallness of the space between the chair and where he stood, which was not a great many feet, and she was aware of her own pulse in the way one sometimes is when something one has been holding very tightly is close to being set down. "Thank you," she said. It came out simpler than she intended, stripped of its formal wrapping, and she did not apologize for it. He went out. She sat with the letter in her hands and the fire at her back and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Mrs. Peel found her the next morning in the kitchen passage. She was a small, precise woman of perhaps 65, with white hair pinned tightly, and eyes that had seen enough to be unimpressed by most things, and she had been the housekeeper at Wrentham for 31 years. She had known the previous Duke and the Duke before that. She had received Cecily's mother twice. On the 2 occasions she had come in person to present the claim. She had given her tea and spoken to her, with the consideration the household's official channels had consistently failed to provide. "I remember your mother clearly," she told Cecily, over a cup of strong tea in the housekeeper's sitting room. The second time she came, she was very tired. She had been traveling since before dawn. I sat with her for 20 minutes while she waited for Fenwick to see her, and she told me about your father and the loan, and she showed me the letter." She paused. "I made a copy." Cecily set down her cup. "You made a copy," she said. I could not give her the resolution she deserved that day. The least I could do was keep a record of what she had brought with her. Mrs. Sullivan. Peel reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded paper, more carefully kept than the original, the ink still clear. "In my handwriting, not hers. I wrote it down exactly as the letter said. I have had it 31 years. Cecily took the paper with both hands. She was steady. She had learned steadiness from the same woman whose handwriting had set all of this in motion, and she held it now as she looked at the copy of her mother's words in a stranger's careful script, and she did not let her breath shake. It was a near thing. She had not learned yet why the Duke had gone silent. 2 days prior, she had noticed it the morning after Mrs. Peel's revelation. He had not appeared at dinner on Wednesday or Thursday, and when she passed him in the corridor on Wednesday afternoon, he was courteous and present, but his attention was elsewhere, turned inward toward some reckoning she could not see. He carried a sheaf of papers under his arm, old ones from the look of them, the kind that come out of sealed cabinets and trunks when a household is making a specific kind of search. He said good morning and walked on, and she stood in the corridor and felt the particular unease of having set something in motion that she could not now observe. She had been prepared for indifference. She had been prepared for polite bureaucratic delay. She had not been prepared for the quality of his attention, or for the way it had already cost him something she had not anticipated. She understood the reason only after. His younger brother Philip had died 4 years ago. She had known this much from Mrs. Peel, who spoke of it as she spoke of all the household sorrows, carefully and without excess. What Mrs. Peel had not told her, because she herself had not known, until the Duke found it in Philip's papers, was that Philip had taken the seal. Not stolen it in the conventional sense, not pawned it or sold it. Philip had borrowed it, in the way that younger sons of unstable temperament sometimes borrow things that belong to titles they will never hold, and he had used it to forge a document of release. The Duke had found the evidence among correspondence Fenwick had sent to Philip 7 years ago. A letter that made clear what Fenwick had proposed and what Philip had agreed to, in exchange for money the estate later had to cover in other ways. Fenwick had suggested it. Philip had complied. And then Philip had died, and the seal had disappeared into the cedar box among her mother's handkerchiefs, and the estate had quietly ceased to pursue the matter of the missing seal, because Fenwick had told the Duke his brother had likely lost it gambling, and the Duke had buried another thing that hurt him alongside everything else. He had been carrying that for 4 years. He had believed himself responsible for what Philip owed, and he had not known that what Philip owed included this. She thought of that in the garden on Friday afternoon, standing near the rose arbor in her green gown, the air cold enough to make her breath visible, and the roses long gone to hips and bare cane. She thought of the portrait of Philip she had seen in the gallery, a young man with the Duke's bone structure but softer, uncertain around the eyes. She thought of what it cost to love someone who had damaged the things you were responsible for, and then left you to find the damage yourself. And she thought that the Duke had been finding it in pieces for 4 years, each piece a different shape of wrong. She heard him come up the path. He stopped beside her at the arbor. He stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air, and he looked at the empty rose canes for a moment before he spoke. "I owe you more than the debt," he said. "You owe me the debt," she said. "You do not owe me more than that." He started to say something about Philip and Fenwick and the forged document, and then stopped. He looked at the bare rose canes for a moment. When he spoke again, the sentence had been rebuilt from the ground. My brother was not a bad man. He was an unformed one. He lacked the thing that makes people hold on when the pressure becomes real. And Fenwick knew it and used it. I did not see it in time. You could not have, she said. You were not meant to. He turned his head and looked at her. She looked back. The air between them was cold and still, and his slate-blue eyes were entirely present. Entirely here, the way they were when he had stood in the library doorway with the candle, and she had thought for the first time that perhaps he was seeing her in the way she had long ago stopped expecting to be seen. His hand moved, and she thought he was going to reach for her, and he stopped short, his fingers an inch from her wrist, and held there. She did not move. Neither did he. Then he stepped back, precise and contained, and said, "You will be safe here." In the way he said things that were commands dressed as assurances, and she watched him go back up the path to the house, and she stood in the cold air, with the warmth still on her wrist where he had almost touched her. She should have been grateful. She was grateful. And she was also aware, for the first time in a long time, of wanting something beyond the resolution of a legal claim, which was an inconvenient thing to notice in a garden outside someone else's great house, with her heart still beating in her throat. She did not know yet what Fenwick had done on Friday evening. On Friday evening, Fenwick had called upon a peer of his acquaintance, who sat on the local magistrates' committee, and on Saturday morning he had arrived at Wrentham House with a document he said he had found among the estate's older files. It was a release of debt, signed and sealed, bearing a date 4 years prior. It stated that the Ashton claim had been settled in full by direct payment to the claimant's representative, and that no further obligation was owed by the Duchy of Wrentham. He presented this at the estate accounts dinner on Saturday evening in front of 9 people. 3 neighboring peers, 2 of their wives, Lady Hardcastle, the estate steward, the vicar of the local parish, and Cecily herself. "The estate has seen many such," Fenwick said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who has prepared his terrain. "Women with old grievances and convenient documents." It is to His Grace's credit that he investigated the matter with due thoroughness, and the record now confirms that this claim was properly settled in 1818. Cecily sat very still at the table. She looked at the document he had placed on the cloth. She looked at the seal. Impression on it, the great seal of the Duchy of Wrentham. She looked at the signature that was supposed to be the signature of her mother's representative, and was not her mother's handwriting, and was not anyone's handwriting she recognized, because it was a forgery, and she knew her mother's hand the way she knew her own. having read the demand letter so many times that the loops and dissenters had printed themselves on the inside of her eyes. "That is not my mother's signature," she said. "Miss Ashton," Lady Hardcastle said, not unkindly, with the particular gentleness of someone preparing to be very firm. "I understand this must be distressing." "The signature does not belong to my mother," Cecily said again. "And the document was not prepared by anyone acting on her behalf." "Miss Ashton." Fenwick's voice was patient. The patience of someone managing a scene. "I understand you had hoped the claim might be honored. The records, however, are quite clear on the matter." She did not look at him. "Where is His Grace?" she asked. No one answered. The table was composed around her. 8 faces, making the small, careful adjustments of people who have decided collectively that a scene is being made and wish to minimize their own involvement in it. Lady Hardcastle said, "His Grace has been called away on estate business. He asked that the accounts proceed in his absence." Cecily looked at her. Then she folded her napkin with great care and set it on the table and excused herself. No one stopped her. She walked to the housekeeper's staircase because it was the fastest route, and she was past the point of worrying about the correct one, and she found Mrs. Peel in the linen room, off the kitchen corridor, organizing the week's inventory. The old woman looked up when she heard Cecily's step, and she read Cecily's face in the way of people who have learned to read a household's weather by its sounds, and she set down the linen without being asked. "He has produced a forged release," Cecily said, bearing the seal. "He claims the debt was settled 4 years ago." Mrs. Peel was very still for a moment. "The copy," Cecily said. "Your copy of my mother's letter. I need to bring it back in with me. Not as proof of the debt the original demand establishes that well enough, as proof of my mother's hand. Anyone who has seen one will know the other did not come from her." Mrs. Peel went to the small iron-hinged box she kept on the shelf above the linen press. She produced the folded paper. She held it out. Cecily took it and looked at it. The ink clear, and the handwriting Mrs. Peel's own neat script, and every word her mother's. She thought of her mother sitting in a room like this one, or smaller, drinking the tea, Mrs. Prax. Peel had made her, carrying this same argument in her own chest, and she breathed in once and folded the copy and put it inside her Spencer jacket and went back upstairs. She had been gone perhaps 12 minutes. The table went quiet when she came back in, a different quality of quiet from before, and she understood as she crossed the threshold that something had changed in her absence. Lady Hardcastle was looking at the door on the far side of the room, not at Cecily. The footman at that door was standing very straight, the particular attention of someone who has just received a communication. Lady Hardcastle opened her mouth. A footman at the far door opened it before she could speak. The Duke came in from the corridor. She had been afraid for the span of 3 seconds that he would look at Fenwick and not at her. That the authority of the document on the table, the seal and the date, and the professional certainty of the man who had placed it there, would outweigh everything else. He did not look at Fenwick. He looked at her first, and the look was brief and entirely direct, and it told her what she needed to know. He took the forged release from the table without asking permission. He held it next to a second document he had carried in with him, and he set them both on the table in front of the vicar, who is the nearest disinterested witness. "The handwriting on the release is Fenwick's own," the Duke said. "I have had 3 separate comparisons made since Wednesday, including one by the clerk at Chancery who examined both documents this morning. He was very calm. He looked at Fenwick. The signature of the claimant's representative is also Fenwick's hand. There was no settlement. There was no representative. There was a forged document prepared by the estate's own solicitor to close a claim he had already extracted payment from, using a seal that he had persuaded my brother to provide." Fenwick's composure cracked the way ice cracks over a river slowly, then all at once. "Your Grace, I must protest." His voice had lost its steadiness. "I must protest in the strongest possible terms. I have served this estate for 30 years. You may protest to the magistrate," the Duke said. "He is aware of the matter. He will be here on Monday. The table was entirely still. He turned and looked at Cecily. The silence in the room was the held-breath silence of 9 people becoming witnesses. "The debt is owed," he said. "Miss Ashton, the house is yours." It was 10 words. It was not a speech. It did not declaim or proclaim or require anyone to applaud. It was a procedural statement, utterly precise, delivered in a level voice to a woman sitting at a dinner table, in a gown that had been let out at the sleeves twice. And it was the most exact thing Cecily had ever heard a man say. She became aware of the pressure behind her eyes and the warmth moving up her throat, and she kept her face level. And she said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and meant it with the whole of herself. Fenwick was escorted from the room by the estate steward and the senior footman. Lady Hardcastle sat very quietly for the remainder of the evening, and when she spoke to Cecily, as the table dispersed, it was in a different register than before, lower and more precise. "Your mother would have been pleased," she said. It was not precisely an apology. It was perhaps the nearest she had to one. Mrs. Peel was in the hall when Cecily came out. She had been told. She stood with her hands folded and her eyes bright, and she said nothing, only touched Cecily's arm briefly, and it was enough. 2 weeks later she stood in Hartfield Cottage. It was not Hartfield Cottage as she had left it, which had been cold and diminished and rented on a lease that had been running out. It was the property in its original form, the 200-year-old house at the end of the village lane, that her grandfather's family had occupied for generations before her father's financial reverses, and which had been folded into the estate's holding in the years of his creditors. The restoration of it was part of the legal settlement, effected through the estate's solicitors, the new ones, who had replaced Fenwick. The Duke had supervised the particulars himself. She was in the sitting room when he arrived. The fire was lit, and the furniture was covered in dust sheets, still, and she had been unwrapping her mother's things from the crates that had been brought from the hired storage in the village, small objects that had traveled with them from lodging to lodging for 3 years. A painting of the Hertfordshire countryside, a chipped porcelain shepherd, a small writing desk with a brass pull on the top drawer. He stopped in the doorway. She was kneeling on the floor with her arms full of folded linen and the cedar box open beside her on the boards, and she looked up at him and thought, not for the first time, that he was very tall in doorways, which was an observation that did not require encouragement to recur. He came inside and closed the door behind him against the cold. "You should have more help," he said. "I wanted to do it myself," she said. The first day she set the linen aside and stood up. He looked at the room. She watched him look at it, the particular attention he brought to everything, the way he stood still, and took in the specific fact of a space, rather than its general impression. He looked at the writing desk. "That was hers," she said. "Yes." She picked up the demand letter from the mantelpiece, where she had set it when she arrived. She looked at it for a moment. The worn creases, the particular color of the paper, the way the ink had faded just slightly, at the edges of her mother's careful letters. She thought about carrying it for 3 years. She thought about reading it in the library while he stood in the doorway with his candle. She thought about all of the different things it had been required to mean, and all of the places it had been folded and unfolded, and all of the mornings she had taken it out and read it, not because she needed to, but because her mother's handwriting was the most reliable present she had left. She crossed to the writing desk and opened the top drawer and set the letter inside it. She closed the drawer. He was watching her. She turned and found him very close, closer than she had expected, close enough that she was aware again of the warmth of him in the cold room, and the steadiness of his eyes, and the particular quality of his presence, which was not overwhelming, but which was entirely complete, the way a well-built room is complete. "Cecily," he said the first time he had used her name. She had known, intellectually, that it would be different when he said it. She had not accounted for how different, the way his voice carried it, the particular weight of a man who chose his words, carefully saying one he had been withholding. She did not say anything. She looked at him. "I would like," he said, and stopped, and she saw the difficulty of it, the controlled effort of a man who had been precise about everything for 36 years. attempting to be precise about this. To call on you formally. If you are willing. She thought of what it had cost him to come here. To follow her to this cottage. To say this word out loud in a cold room with dust sheets on the furniture and a single fire against the January cold. She thought of his hand above her wrist in the garden, the inch he had left between his fingers and her pulse. I am willing, she said. He did not smile, exactly. Something in his face changed nonetheless. The set of it, the quality of the stillness, some small and specific softening that she thought she might spend considerable time learning to read. He said, "Thank you," and she recognized the cadence of it because she had used exactly the same words at the dinner table 2 weeks ago, stripped of their formal wrapping, and she understood that he was returning it to her deliberately. She put her hand out. Not for shaking. She simply extended it, fingers open, an offering of the same inch he had left in the garden, and she watched his face as he understood what she was doing, and she watched him reach out and take her hand in his and hold it, gloved in his, in the warm air between them. They stood like that for a moment. The fire behind her crackled and settled. Outside, the January light was doing what January light does in England, going gray and thin at the edges of things, and through the sitting room window the lane was bare and cold, and the village beyond it was quiet. In some months there would be green there. In some months the garden that had been her grandmother's would be worked back into something living, and there would be light through these windows that had no dust on it, and she would hear the kitchen sounds that she had not heard since she was 8 years old. And none of it would feel like what she deserved, because she had long ago stopped applying that particular word to herself. She had only asked for what was owed. What she had received was something beyond the scope of any document. She did not yet have a word for it. She suspected she would find one. She looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and the fire was warm, and the drawer was closed, and the cottage was still. And she was, at last. Thank you for staying to the end of Cecily's story. If this one moved you, the comment below is the right place to leave her name.